Chapter 8. Sophie. One quest to save them all. Where is the cake, Bogdan? Where are the gift bags? Where is the bouquet? Sophie berated, barreling towards Evil Hall in her white taffeta gown, crystal tiara, and spiked silver heels.
You need those things for a school dance?
Bogdan asked, holding her train and stumbling behind. All Tedros had to do to seal his reign was host a coronation, and now look where he is. You know why kingdoms fall, Bogdan? Because of bad parties. Sophie flared. How long until the doors open?
5 minutes. The welcome committee is almost done decorating.
Why don't I hear music then? Why don't I smell cucumber and dill butter canapes? Bogdan gaped at her. Were you taking notes when we went over this? Sophie squawked, trundling towards the ballroom. No wonder you failed all your classes.
Dean, Sophie, I've been knocking on your bathroom door for 5 hours to ask questions.
As if anyone has time for questions. First Gavaldon girl caves in a classroom, and now you with your questions. Why did I bring readers into this school at all? Sophie moaned. This is the first time a dean has ever thrown an evil party. The first time the Evers will see our castle, and the first time Clarissa Dovey will realise there's no need for a new schoolmaster when the students already follow me. I've even invited the Royal Rot, in case they want to write a story about Tedros's former flame, moved on to a life of staggering success and fawning fans, unlike her once prince and now maligned king. She flung open the doors to Evil Hall with a dramatic flourish. The ballroom was lit dungeon brown by 2 dying torches. The 6 first-year nevers of the welcome committee beamed proudly at her as they hung wispy tinsel and laid out a cloudy punch bowl on a crooked wooden table, along with a hunk of misshapen cheese. In the centre of the room, under a dented mirror ball, 2 bats perched on top of Sophie's statue, swiping and eating circling moths attracted by the weak, pulsing lights. A banner drooped between 2 walls. Dean Sophie welcomes you, with the U looking more like a V, since the painters had started their letters too big and run out of space. A wolf slumped on the floor beneath the banner, burping loudly and playing a dirge on a broken violin. Sophie clutched her throat. It's like one of Honora's garden parties. She whirled to Bogdan. Where's Hort?
Professor Hort said if he can't be your date, he's not coming.
Sophie curled her fists. That whiny, mangy rodent! Through the windows she saw the lights of fairies leading the Evers through Good's glass castle towards Halfway Bridge. Oh, I try to empower you fools like I'm supposed to, and make you feel supported and involved and appreciated. Sophie seethed, shaking her fists. But if you want something done right, you have to do it yourself. In a flash, she whirled into action, pointing fingers at the welcome committee. Fatima, fetch an enchanted pot from the kitchen. Barnaby, get a pouch of lizard tongues and a vial of cat tears from Professor Manley. If he won't give them to you, steal them. Vladimir, remember that putrid band you formed? The one you sent us to the doom room for because you said we ruined your beauty sleep? He peeped, blinking beneath his unibrow. It's legal for one night only, Sophie commanded. Rex, open up the windows. Barty, borrow Professor Sheik's spellbook. The password to her office is Ooty Queen. And someone tell Professor Hort if he doesn't get here in the next 10 seconds, I'll tell the whole school their history teacher sleeps with a stuffed turtle. Her finger glowed pink, and she thrust it at the mirror ball, which blinded all of them in an explosion of red. 5 minutes later, Sophie sat on the shoulders of Hort's giant man-wolf, cheerily greeting awed evers and nevers as they came through the doors. Towering 7 feet tall, Hort made sure to roar for each one and beat his hairy chest, while the first years moved into Evil Hall, glittering with magical red and gold fireworks that ripped across the ceiling, spelling Night of 1,000 Sophies. On the walls, scarlet shadows played scenes from Sophie's fairy tale, occasionally reaching out to spook passing kids. In the corner, Evers and Nevers filled their cups with sparkly soda from a fountain made out of 200 crystal goblets. The glittering liquid changed colours and flavours every minute. Green apple, golden honey, red raspberry, blue winter mint. Nearby, a horde of kids raided a table with trays that magically replenished with wasabi shrimp, herbed biscuits, persimmon bruschetta, dill-stuffed cucumbers, pork-wrapped mushrooms, baked potato bites, salmon pinwheels, olive crostini, and vanilla sage canapes. But most of the revellers were jam-packed in the centre around Sophie's statue, head-banging to Vladimir's band. Vladimir and the plague, the drums said, while Good's fairies sprinkled fairy dust on band members, levitating them over the crowd. A few intrepid Nevers scooped fallen fairy dust off the floor and gobbed it under their tongues, sending them shooting across the dance floor like comets, earning raucous cheers. And they've all dressed for the theme, Sophie marvelled, high atop Hort's shoulders, as both Evergirls and Nevergirls thronged in, flaunting Sophie's most famous looks from The Tale of Sophie and Agatha. There was a kimono Sophie with shimmering makeup and ruby red hair, a baby doll Sophie in a black lacy dress and licking a pink lollipop, a no-ball Sophie complete with pink gown, bald cap and stick-on warts, an evil Queen Sophie in full black leather and snakeskin cape, a rebel Sophie in a dazzling slit-back black dress with red sequins that spelled F is for fabulous. There were even a few Phillips. Not to be left out, several boys had dressed like Tedros, with some in his creamy white breeches and royal blue lace-up shirt from the first-year Evers ball, a few in his loose ivory shirt and black pants from his night with Sophie in an Avalon cave, and 2 tall Never boys who'd worn the tightest of shorts and foregone shirts entirely. "Oh, darling, there's even one of you," Sophie said, pointing to a bone-thin, rabbit-faced boy in handmade frog pyjamas who'd just spilled his drink on a girl. "Got the pyjamas wrong," Hort's man-wolf grumped. "Oh, don't be a louse. You know they're all having so much fun, I can't tell the evers from the nevers anymore," said Sophie, watching more of Good's students flood in with giddy smiles, as if they'd secretly been waiting their whole lives for an evil party. Even the teachers have stopped searching for a reason to shut it down. Professor Manley and Professor Sheeks were snickering as they stealthily shot flames across the soda fountain every time an Ever reached for a glass. Nearby, Castor and Professor Anemone shook their rumps on the dance floor while students of both schools hooted them on. "Listen, I can't last much longer like this. I'm hot, hairy, and hungry," Hort grouched, drool dripping from his snout. "Any second I'm going to shrink back to human without any clothes on." "You can't go now. The room 46 boys are almost here," Sophie said, squinting at a pack of Ever boys crossing the bridge. "I knew Bodie, Lathan, and the rest of their delicious little clan would come, even if they didn't RSVP. Handsome boys never RSVP. They just grace you with their presence like a balmy day in winter." "What? Who's Bodie? Who's Lathan?" Hort growled. "How do you know Ever boys' names?" "Don't be ridiculous. Everybody knows the boys of Honor Tower, room 46. Besides, I'm sure you can last as a man-wolf for as long as you want. Think of first year, when you could only do it for 5 seconds. Now you can go all night if you put your mind to it." "I'm not lasting all night for a bunch of Ever boys," Hort snapped. "Don't be irrelevant, darling," Sophie wisped. "For 6 months I've been obsessing over Agatha and Tedros, wondering how they were doing in Camelot. I know I said I hadn't given them the slightest thought, but we both know that's a lie, so I might as well be honest. I couldn't bear the idea that they could be happy without me, even after that hellfire of a coronation. But tonight's the first night I haven't thought of them at all. Which goes to show, if Agatha doesn't want me to help her plan her wedding, then I'll happily throw a party for myself. And I assure you, mine will be far better." She smiled as the fireworks over the dance floor arranged into a vision of her own face, and students from both schools hollered their approval. Nearby, kids dug into a red velvet cake, shaped as a giant S, and flanked by piles of oat ginger cookies frosted with sayings like, "S is for sublime," "S is for succulent," "S is for Sophie." A pimply, sharp-toothed Never boy climbed her statue and kissed it triumphantly, eliciting whistles and cheers, but Sophie didn't mind it in the least. Soaking in the ever-never chants from the dance floor, "Sophie! Sophie! Sophie!" If you think about it, Aggie and I don't even have much in common anymore, Sophie added, waving back at the adoring crowd. She has her life with Tedros, the two of them about to marry and become each other's family. And I have my own life, weddingless, familyless, dateless, but so filled with possibilities. I thought I was your date, Hort said.
Look at my little peaches. Aren't they scrumptious?
Sophie gushed, nodding at a few awkward never-girls in hip-hugging black leather talking to a shrimpy ever-boy. Spent all week teaching them how to fake self-esteem. What do you think? They're all your age. Any of them catch your fancy?
My what? Are you insane?
Hort retorted.
Not only are they first years, but I'm their Put me down!
Sophie gasped.
What? Down, Hort! Down!
Hort quickly swung her to the floor, and Sophie lunged in front of him. Bodie, darling, welcome to my school. Sophie purred, holding out her hand to a tall, reedy boy in a royal blue coat with dark caramel skin and big black eyes, who gently took it and kissed it like a prince. And hello, Lathan. You're looking exceptionally handsome tonight, she said to his short, muscular friend with chestnut hair and freckles. Lathan smiled flirtily and kissed her on the cheek. Well, if that's how you're going to say hello, I'll say hello to all of you, Sophie cooed, presenting her cheek to the rest of their ever-boy gang. Swimmery, silver-haired Akiro, dark wavy-haired Valentine, bald-headed, ghostly Devon. Save a dance for me, she whispered to each one.
A dance?
Hort hissed in her ear, apoplectic.
You're a dean, not a hostess at the Pig and Pepper. You can't dance with students.
I've combed the Ever-Never handbook thoroughly and see no rules against it. And besides, some of these boys look far older than I do, Sophie said, turning to greet the next boy. Only it wasn't a boy at all. It was a dean. And she wasn't alone. Dean Dovey clacked past Sophie into Evil Hall, green gown sweeping behind her, as if this was her school and Sophie the intruder. The silver-haired professor was flanked by 3 witches, each of who glared at Sophie one by one.
Ever boys in our castle,
said the tattooed witch.
Ever boys in our school,
said the albino witch. Told you, told you, told you, huffed the jolly witch, turning Sophie's tiara into chocolate and gobbling it down in one bite. You lied to me, Sophie mewled, gaping at Clarissa's quest map floating over the sand on Evil's side of Halfway Bay. All her classmates' names were coloured red beneath their moving figurines instead of blue, like they were on her map. But I'm supposed to know everything. I'm a dean. I'm your equal. Instead, you give me a false map. You make me think all our quests are going well. You keep me in the dark on the fact my friends are failing miserably.
Friends is a loose term,
Hester murmured.
And you being equal to Dovey is like Dot being equal to me,
said Anna Dill. We'll see who's equal when I turn your rats to fudge, said Dot. Oh, be quiet, girls, Professor Dovey said, sitting gingerly in one of Evil's cabanas that Sophie had added when she turned the once barren shores of Halfway Bay into a beach. Music and laughter from the party carried down the hill. With the August nights sultry and fresh, the elder dean had recommended they speak outside, where students wouldn't overhear. But now Dovey was peering around at the torchlit huts, decorated with glamorous portraits of Sophie. The golden sand, speckled with S-shaped conches. The once sludgy black moat of Evil turned royal blue, with a statue of Sophie astride a dragon spraying water from its mouth. "I honestly don't know where I am," she murmured. Sophie cleared her throat harshly. "I know you're upset, Sophie, and you have every right to be." Professor Dovey sighed, massaging her knees. "Fairy godmothers don't make it a habit of using magic to deceive. But fairy godmothers also have a duty to protect the greater good. If you'd known what was happening, it was only a matter of time before word of the older students' struggles leaked through the school and distracted the first years. I know you'll say you can keep a secret, but frankly you seem incapable of setting boundaries with your new charges at the moment." Sophie put her hands on her hips. "What in heavens makes you say that?" Dovey turned towards the castle's open windows. Inside Evil Hall, two Neverboys danced saucily on Sophie's statue, while an Everboy spotted Sophie watching and yelled, "Dean Sophie, will you marry me?" Sophie stabbed out her glowing pink finger, shutting the windows and drawing the curtains. "Well, if you were so scared of telling me about these failing quests, why are you telling me now?" Professor Dovey turned to her. "Because I need you to lead a quest into the woods and save your fellow classmates before any more of them die." Every trace of defiance melted out of Sophie's face. She saw the three witches staring at Good's Dean the same way. "Die!" Sophie rasped. Professor Dovey looked away, mouth quivering. Sophie could hardly get the word out. "Who?" The elder dean watched the waters of the bay roll between good and evil, thin to thick, water to slime. "The map," Dovey whispered. Slowly, Sophie and the witches raised their eyes to the dean's quest map. Its names in red alarm red, so different from the cool, serene blues Sophie had seen across her doctored one. But one name was different. Its ink was darker red than the others, and dripping off its label, as if seeping blood. A thin black line ran through the name, scratching it out. The name was Chaddick. Sophie's breath caught. In a single mark, a soul lost. For a long while no one spoke, the silence broken only by the festive buzz behind them and the snores of sleeping stimps overhead, perched on the scaffolding shrouding the schoolmaster's tower. Dot wiped her eyes, while Annadil focused on the ground. Even Hester, looked unsteady. Gazing across the lake at Good's glass castle, Sophie thought of the burly, grey-eyed Everboy who'd once swaggered down those halls and been Tedros's most faithful liege, just like Agatha had been her own. But Agatha was still alive, of course, even if she was somewhere far away. Tedros's best friend was dead. How? Sophie stammered. We don't know, said Professor Dovey emptily. His body must be in Avalon. Otherwise, his figure would have moved on the map. Avalon, Sophie remembered. On her quest map, she'd seen Chaddock's figurine there when he should have been off seeking new knights for Tedros's kingdom. What was Chaddock doing alone in Avalon, which was perpetually cold and uninhabited? It's not like he could get into the Lady of the Lake's castle. Only Merlin or the King of Camelot could do that. And yet, she distinctly remembered seeing Chaddock's figurine inside the castle gates. Still, even if he did get in somehow, wouldn't the Lady of the Lake have protected him? Chaddock was Camelot's knight. Dovey's voice severed her thoughts. He sent me a note by Crow a couple weeks ago. He'd been hearing reports of attacks in the woods and wanted to find out who was behind them. I ordered him not to make a move, to stay on his original mission. Clearly, he disobeyed. Sophie looked at her. Whatever he found must have gotten him killed, the dean said quietly. And now you want me to go and get killed too? Sophie asked. Unlike Chaddock, you will have friends at your side, the dean replied, eyeing the three witches. There's that word friends again, Hester murmured. Dovey ignored her. I'd been looking into the news of attacks long before Chaddock wrote. The moment students' names started turning red on my map, I'd asked Merlin to investigate. It's common for students' quests to go badly at first. We've certainly dispatched rescue teams before. But for all to be failing was unprecedented. At the same time, we'd been hearing reports of unrest in the woods, prompted by seemingly random crimes against Evers and Nevers alike. And then there was the matter of Tedros's sword, stuck in that stone. I thought Merlin could get to the bottom of all this. Well, a few days ago he finally returned to my chambers. He asked only one question. What fairy tale had the Storian been writing? Nothing of substance. I've told you that, Sophie said, glancing up at the schoolmaster's tower, now her private quarters, which was connected to Evil's castle by a catwalk. She saw the Storian through the window, hovering over a stone table littered with crumpled paper. Ever since it finished mine and Agatha's fairy tale, it's been starting and discarding tales of our classmates' quests. And whose story is it working on now? Said Dovey. It stopped writing completely last week, which, after all that frantic scribbling and crumpling the past few months, is actually letting me sleep. Sophie puffed. But you said that the historian often suspects a fairy tale will be a good one, only to scrap it mid-story. That it's perfectly normal. To a point. Professor Dovey replied. The historian only writes tales that we need, stories that will redress a balance between good and evil that is constantly in flux. But 6 months is a long time for the historian not to put a new tale into the woods. Perhaps it sees no story in your classmates' failing quests worth telling. Merlin, however, believes all these failures are connected, and that there is a bigger quest waiting to be undertaken, that this is the fairy tale the historian needs to tell. Yet you have no proof of this bigger quest or fairy tale, said Sophie. And yet we still have to go with her, Hester said, leering at Sophie. A student is dead, girls. I'd think at the very least you'd want to bury his body, let alone find out what killed him, said Professor Dovey frostily. I do. Sophie and the witches fell silent. There is also the fact that, according to the map, you are all failing your quests, too, Professor Dovey said. Sophie and the coven gawked at her before swivelling to the map. They'd been so focused on their classmates that they hadn't noticed their own names were in red. How can I be failing? Sophie protested. My quest is to be Dean of Evil. That's the quest Lady Lesso gave me. And how could we be failing? Said Hester, looking at her witch friends. We didn't do anything wrong on our quest. Unless, of course, your quests no longer apply, said Professor Dovey. Sophie and the witches exchanged confused looks. You see, your names only turned red on my map yesterday, within minutes of Chaddock's death, said Professor Dovey. I highly doubt it's a coincidence. The historian creates a quest map every 3 years once the new class goes into the woods. The fact the pen has stopped writing, combined with your names turning red, only strengthened Merlin's and my conclusion that a new, more important quest awaits each of you. Only then will the historian begin its next tale. She paused, expecting questions, but Sophie and the witches still looked dazed. If it was up to me, Merlin and I would go into the woods ourselves, Dovey went on. But teachers cannot directly interfere with a student's quest, just as we cannot interfere in a fairy tale. Which means you will represent the Nevers on this new quest, and Merlin will be sending an Ever contingent tonight to join your team. Given Chaddock's demise, all of this was too sensitive to be transmitted in any way other than in person. So that's why I brought you back to school. You must leave as soon as possible to prevent more casualties. But you're not just a rescue team. You're a detective team. Something out there is hurting our students, and your new quest is to find it. One quest to save them all. Sophie couldn't focus, a single thought haunting her. Has anyone told Tedros about... No, Professor Dovey answered, rising from her seat. Telling Tedros will surely lead to him doing something rash, especially since we've yet to learn how his friend died. The island of Avalon, then, should be the first stop on your new quest. Even if you can't get through the castle's gates, you might find clues as to what Chaddock was doing there. Sophie's mind went gauzy, as if she was trying to wake from a dream. Dead friends? Bodies to be buried? A mysterious threat? How quickly things change in a fairy tale. A few minutes ago she was the host of a rollicking party that finally helped her turn the page and begin a new chapter. But now she was facing a new quest far away from school, where her life would be as much at risk as the friends' lives she had to save. Only she wasn't ready to leave this place. After 3 years, she'd found her way out of a fairy tale and wouldn't let herself be dragged back into one. And the best part about being evil was that she could admit this without guilt. The new and improved Sophie could accept the selfish shades of her soul as much as the generous ones. Which meant that no matter how terrible she felt for Chaddock and the rest of her old friends out there in the dark, endless woods, Sophie wouldn't be the one to help them. I'm afraid I'm dean of a school just like you, Professor Dovey, entrusted with more than 100 students. I can't just abandon them, Sophie decided. I don't care what your map says. Hester, Annadil, and Dot will do just fine on their own. The 3 witches blinked at each other as if they'd telepathically made a wish and had it granted. Professor Dovey tightened her silvery bun. Sophie, you might be a dean, but you're also a 4th-year student, which means I can change your quest just like you changed Hort's. And once a dean assigns your quest, you must accept it, or be sent to the brig of betrayers. Don't you threaten me, Clarissa, Sophie retorted, watching Dovey wince at her first name. You can't tell me what to do. I know you want to get rid of me, given how fond of evil your good students are, and this gives you the perfect excuse. You think this is about you. I should have known. Every time it seems you've changed, I'm reminded how selfish you can be, said Professor Dovey. Your first 3 years you trampled on students of both schools to further your own arrogant, often cowardly goals. You punished them, tormented them, betrayed them. And yet they forgave you, and even obeyed you as their dean in the remaining months of their 3rd year. They showed you the loyalty you never once showed them. Now these same classmates are in peril and need your help, which means the story isn't about you anymore, Sophie. It's about them. But if you would like to make it about you, then think of it this way. This is no longer a tale about whether you will find fame or fortune or your perfect little happy ending. This is a tale about whether you are capable of growing from the snake of your own story into the hero of someone else's. That is your new quest. That is the tale the historian is waiting to write. Sophie went quiet, her emerald eyes fixed on the elder Dean. A dark crimson spread into her cheeks, and for a moment she looked less like evil's leader and more like a chastened child. "She's coming, isn't she?" Hester mumbled, her demon making faces.
Please don't tell me you can turn a person to chocolate,
Annadil asked Dot. "I have enough trouble with lentil cakes, thank you," Dot nipped. Sophie wasn't listening, her focus drifting to the party uphill. "But who will take over as evil's dean?" she asked weakly. "Professor Manley," said the elder dean, adding before Sophie could object, "and I suspect his unpopularity will only increase your status once you return." "If I return, you mean?" Sophie corrected. She expected Professor Dovey to reassure her, but the dean said nothing. "And what about the new schoolmaster?" asked Hester. "We spent the last 6 months combing the woods for someone who would best serve the school." "New schoolmaster? That was your quest? To find a schoolmaster?" Sophie asked, whirling to Professor Dovey. "You left the choosing of the one person who has control over you and me to them?" "And I still would," Professor Dovey said. "But that's not to say that part of their assignment is over. You may very well come across the right candidate on your new quest, girls, and if you do, I expect a full report so I can interview them myself." This seemed to appease both the coven, who wanted to see the job through, and Sophie, who fully intended to supervise the schoolmaster's selection now that she was along for the trip. "In the meantime, I'll keep tabs on the historian with the rest of the faculty," said Professor Dovey. "Though, as Merlin pointed out, if there was one lesson in the tale of Sophie and Agatha, it's that the historian does a rather remarkable job of protecting itself." "Speaking of Merlin, which Evers is he sending to be on our quest?" Hester asked. "It better not be Beatrix and her rancid minions," Sophie griped. "And how do you expect us to travel? On foot? I'm famous now. The whole world knows my fairy tale. I can't be traipsing from kingdom to kingdom in a dirty dress." The clocks in both castles tolled midnight, drowning her out, while Professor Dovey peered at the bay. "Merlin assured me his Ever team would be here by now. Do you see them?" Sophie and the witches exchanged glances, as if the old dean had stayed up too long past her bedtime. Wouldn't they be arriving at the south gate?" Sophie said delicately. Suddenly, a ripple burped at the midpoint of the bay, right in front of the schoolmaster's tower. The sound it made was low and croaky, like a dyspeptic toad's. Then more ripples formed, faster and faster, spewing bubbles of clear water and blue sludge into the sky, each burp more violent than the last, as if the bay was trying to expel something it had swallowed. Then, in one willful spurt, the hull of a ship popped through the surface, only upside down, with the rest of the ship buried beneath the bay. It took a final cacophonous belch to send the hull toppling over and turn the ship right side up. A glorious blue and gold, billowing with creamy white sails, and the name Igraine painted along the bow near a masthead statue of a young, dark-haired woman dangling a lantern over the sea. For a moment, as water and slime drained off the vessel and it propelled towards the shore, Sophie thought it must be a ghost ship, for there didn't seem to be a captain. But then she saw a shadowy figure at the prow in a dark leather jacket and cut-off breeches, hair tied up in a bandana. And from what she could see, he was sharp-jawed, fine-featured, and handsome. Yet, as the boat slid onto torchlit banks and stuttered to a stop, Sophie saw for the second time in one evening that the boy she'd been expecting was not a boy at all.
"Agatha?"
she choked. Her friend was already throwing a rope over the side of the ship and sliding down. The two girls dashed towards each other and collided in a breathless hug, falling into the bay. Sophie's white dress was slopped in sludge, but she didn't care. Gripping Agatha like she might never let go, both of them caught between giggles and tears. On the shore, Professor Dovey was dabbing her eyes, as were Dot and Annadil, each of who knew what it meant to have a best friend. Even Hester was biting her lip.
"I missed you, Aggie,"
Sophie whispered. "Not as much as I missed you. They made Pollux give me wedding lessons," Agatha said breathlessly.
"That little weenie? In Camelot?"
Sophie squeaked. "Giving wedding advice." "A wedding you're now in charge of planning," said Agatha. Sophie burst into laughter. "Good heavens, we have a lot to catch up on." She kissed her dearest friend and nuzzled against her. "But now that I have you, I'm not letting you go. Even if you didn't write me, even if I thought you'd forgotten all about me, I love you, Agatha. I always will." Her friend held her close. "I love you too. And I never forgot about you, Sophie. I never could." Sophie hugged her tighter.
"I'm here!"
a voice shouted. The girls turned to see Hort bounding around the side of the bay, naked except for a tablecloth from the party wrapped around his waist.
"I tried to follow you, but then my man-wolf started shrinking, and it got really bad, and then it took me forever to find you guys, so, yeah."
He bent over, panting.
"What did I miss?"
He took one look at Professor Dovey and the three witches goggling at him, then at two girls embraced in the sand, gaping at him too, Sophie's red lipstick on Agatha's cheek.
"Not again!"
Hort gasped. Only the girls weren't looking at Hort at all. They were looking past him at a tall silver tower rising out of the bay, an open window lit by the moon, a sharp steel pen sweeping ink across a page. The Storian. Writing. A new fairy tale had begun.